Hi, everybody. Today's July 11th, 7/11, for those who want to play craps or something like that. Uh, we're not doing that. We're actually playing the facts. And I'm here with the illustrious, intelligent chemical engineer and fat emperor, Ivor Cummins. Um, I'm struck by your title, Fat Emperor, because you're not fat, actually. You might very well be the emperor. I might vote for you for emperor if emperors get votes. Tell us, Ivor, what you've been up to and how you've uncovered the underpinnings of our world.
All right, Randall. Well, great to be here. And very briefly, I was aware of most stuff around the geopolitical kind of running of the world, largely WEF and all these other, agents, if you will, very powerful agents, obviously. And in 22, I discovered a talk by Dr. Jakob Nordengård in Sweden, and he had done a PhD in 2012 on the massive power of the Rockefellers and how they shaped the world. And his book on pharosmedia.se, I guess you'll have a link, Rockefeller Controlling the Game. And he actually, just very briefly, had been a climate activist type, ponytailed assistant professor in the Swedish university, and they're very climatey. Mm-hmm. So he was worried. He'd studied for decades or so energy politics, peak oil, and he was genuinely left of center and really worried about climate disaster and the end of oil. Perfect person to find the truth if it ends up being the opposite of his bias. So he kept asking professors, because he was so obsessed with this in Swedish universities, the climate professors, what are the origins? I want to really understand all the science, yada, yada, yada. And what he found is none of them could tell him anything before 1990 approx, the founding of the UN IPCC. And he said, but what about before that? It didn't just appear out of nowhere. And they didn't know. And he realized, like I explored the medical world 10 years ago, he realized the experts don't know the origins. They don't know the data. They don't know where it came from. How is that possible? That's crazy. So like me and the medical stuff 10 years ago, he began to dig. And exactly like me, 2 or 3 weeks later of obsessive study, and he followed the path. And it went back to the 50s and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. So that's where climate science comes from. The richest men in the world, the most powerful men in the world, created climate science in the 1950s. So his story explaining the 50s right up to the WEF in 2020 and COVID, when I got that, it filled in all the blanks. And yes, it's important, Randall, to note, people often say to me, but behind Rockefellers, powerful as they are, there are bigger forces like massive banking families. Fine, there's all of that. However, for lay people, we need to let know how the world is run. They only need to start with Rockefeller in the 50s through to today, WEF, Club of Rome, Trilateral Commission, etc., etc. That's plenty. They don't need to really know, not to be arrogant, not presupposing, they don't really need to know about the Rothschilds, the Wagners, the people who gamed World War I and World War II. It gets a bit too big and not documented fully. So we always need to go with what's fully documented, like Nordengård's PhD on the Rockefellers, massively referenced, and Rockefeller lawyers tried to stop his PhD being defended back 10 years ago, and they failed, of course.
I have Jakob Nordengård's book on order, and I was reading recently the thing I just posted, Elizabeth Nixon's Substack. She covers this, and I think it's not an uncommon phenomenon for those who have wealth, or perhaps secondarily those who inherit wealth, to have this kind of guilt over it. I mean, I think it's a very deep aspect of our souls. If you work at something and you earn it, I think you can be pretty brash about it. Let's see. Example, Donald Trump. I mean, obviously his dad had some money. And he gave Donald $1 million, but Donald turned that and parlayed it into something bigger and bigger. I don't think he's feels any real guilt or compunction or sadness over making it. I think that people who get stuff who don't really there's some kind of illicit aspect to it. They want to I think they want to do penance in some way. And those who inherit wealth, I think, are doing double duty in this regard. In this case, is John D. Rockefeller's son, Lawrence, I think, who's the kind of central figure in the Rockefeller Foundation part. I mean, obviously there was Nelson and
David.
John Rockefeller II or whatever. And which one?
Well, David Rockefeller of the Rockefeller
Yeah.
Brothers, pretty big wheel, chased Manhattan Bank, ran the Trilateral Commission, or was it the Council for Foreign Relations, from 80s up to the 90s, key period. David's pretty big wheel, but Nelson, vice president, big wheel. Lawrence, he looked after the whole climate nonsense for them. He got all into that nonsense.
Apparently, and I was interested in this. Lawrence coined the term New Age.
Oh, gotta say this. You know who coined the term New World Order? And you'll get demonetized on YouTube now, and warning is put to New World Order as a conspiracy theory, right? You know who brought, as far as I'm aware, who made that up? Rockefeller Brothers Fund in the 1950s. They said, it is our duty to create a new world order in all its dimensions, financial, spiritual, governmental. They even claimed spiritual, a new world order they wanted.
Yeah, no, it's funny how words come out one way and then they get flipped around on their heads. So that was a good phrase. So that's what they wanted. And then when it turns out that there's some connotations, then it turns like they disavow it. And the opposite is the case with the, I don't know if you're familiar with the American Ivy League. That's seen as a kind of the opposite formulation. It's seen as a badge of honor, but it was actually started as an insult. The Ivy League was there to point out that they're in these ivory, no pun on your name, ivory towers, covered with ivy leagues. Everything's starting with Ivor today, and they were so divorced from reality. They were in this Ivy League of primped up specialness and so forth. But over time, people forgot that, and it became a term of endearment and a term badge of honor. And so, in the opposite sense, New World Order, that was their own term of art, I guess.
Just one clarification and a disclosure. I'll have to say it, Randall. I know you talk about people and whether they feel guilty and they want to save the world. My opinion, and the opinion of the majority, I think, who understand this history. Now, Dr. Nordengard did call me up on one thing I said. I said the word evil. And he said, we need to keep in mind that those guys believe what they're doing. They believe that they are the leaders of the planet. Okay. So they think that what they're doing is almost like God's work. However, my position, John Dee's father was a rapist and a literal snake oil salesman who got away with the rape of a household member. That's on the record, a servant. John Dee himself, I would say, is a dyed-in-the-wool sociopath, and all of his actions reflect that. And those five brothers were brought up as indoctrinated sociopaths, essentially, with a God complex. So I think all of this comes from the very worst of human nature. However, these five brothers, maybe some of them have convinced themselves that what they were trying to do was good. But, that's my position.
Yeah. No, I look, humans are humans, and humans are going to do human things. And none of us come out perfect. None of us remain in the realm of perfection for very long. A lot of us just happen to be right, like a broken clock twice a day. And so I'm not going to put myself above that. I think that, all these, I've had on Daniel Jupp, who has a book, The Gates of Hell, which could easily be reversed and titled The Hell of Gates. And how Bill Gates ruined the world. I had on Scott McKay, who has a book on Barack Obama. The various ways that these men have kind of taken a vision, perverted it, and applied it to all. I think it's I think it's Maoist. I think there's kind of a thing within all of us when we get and achieve some fame in one realm, we're going to apply it elsewhere. I call it the Linus Pauling syndrome. Linus Pauling actually has 2 Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and one in medicine, I believe, and they were for biochemical aspects. And then he went on this kind of tirade or jihad or something about vitamin C. He had no real backing of it, and he was convinced vitamin C saved the world. all that kind of stuff. And he was wrong about it. But that didn't stop him. And he had the podium and the power and the prestige from the Nobel and so forth to do that. And it's not saying he's not a bright guy, but the thing is, when people get outside their lane, in a sense, they get this God complex, as you put it, and they go for it. And no pun intended, God bless them, because they are doing what they think is right. And there might be some germ of it. I mean, Elon Musk is doing the same thing, and I think we can agree that he's doing it in a better way. He's doing it in consideration of kind of the small people and the small voices. So it comes down to not the fact that they're doing it. I mean, I wish I had a few extra billion hanging around. I'd share some with you and some other friends and whatnot. And I think we have a vision. The question is not so much that you shouldn't take your wealth and do something with it, because what else are you going to do with it? I mean, how many power boats can you have? And the question is, then you apply your vision. And I think the real point is how these visions always become, I guess, perverted or perverse, perhaps in the origin. And some of it, filters out in some of the things that we are seeing pushed by major groups such as WEF and whatnot, and towards transgendering, transhumans, transitioning, so forth. I wonder if you can maybe speak to the general, I guess, moral implications of some of this.
Yeah, okay. So I think our problem is that there's lots of very wealthy people are billionaires, and a certain proportion get a God complex, like you described. Some of them, it's a pretty good God complex. Or if you say Elon, he's obsessed with free speech and he wants everything to be fair and the Constitution, and that's all great stuff. And he put 40-something billion into Twitter and literally said he was willing to lose it. That's good billionaires. There's another guy who, a TED talk he gave, Nick H, begins with H, forget now, multi-billionaire, who founded one of the Amazon type companies. And he gave a TED talk and he basically said, guys, if you want the world to improve, you're going to have to tax me. You're going to have to tax ultra billionaires, because basically we're using the money. We're not really creating jobs. We're putting the money where we get the best return. It doesn't always mean jobs. He said, I have 3 or 4 pairs of jeans. I don't have 5,000 pairs of jeans. I don't contribute back to the economy. I have a few cars. I don't have thousands of cars commensurate with my worth. He said, basically, you need to tax us. And he was very candid about it. He was a good billionaire who told the truth. What happened? His talk was taken down after a day by TED, and they said it was maybe too political. Rubbish. He was telling people the truth. So there's good billionaires. Unfortunately, I think most of them who get really wealthy get the God complex, and not in a good way, unfortunately. And I think a lot of them simply just look after their own wealth and don't rock the boat, and they're neutral. But the sociopaths climb to the top. They always have, they always will. They clamber up and up and up because they want more. When you have infinite money or close to it, there's only one thing that can feed your bug, feed the itch. It's power, money and power. When you've got all the money, you need power, these guys. So that's just an overview of how I see it. And I think it's the same from Shaka Zulu in Africa, so long ago, Roman Empire, revolutions, all of the problems of humanity are in cycles. The rich and powerful get control. They do their God thing and it's nasty. And eventually there's a revolution and they're overthrown. And then everyone gets fat and soft and comfy, egalitarian, everything's great. And then slowly the sociopaths get to the top again. And then you need another revolution, ultimately. So that's my quote. The morality.
I'm not sure we need another revolution. It depends on the revolution. It depends from.
It can be soft and quiet. It can just be pushing back, and they back away like I don't know, little insects into the shadows again. But right now, I think awareness is growing of what we're talking about. I think there could be a soft, slow pushback, which is great. Because if people don't slow the progress of what's going on right now, and we could talk about that, all the different strategies that these nutters, they're going to end up with enough technocracy power, and we'll end up like China, with universal ID, cameras on every corner, and it'll be very hard to push back because cancelling will become as easy as just flicking a switch if they get central bank digital currency. That's a huge one. If they get that, the means to even push back, sadly, I don't want to be negative, it kind of ends. We enter a new age unlike any cycle before. With CBDC, you've got the ultimate light switch for any individual who is problematic. Get difficult then.
So what's your, I mean, it seems to me that everything's kind of flowing towards a accumulation of memory of individuals, memory of actions, and kind of a blockchain aspect of recording. I think with enough data, even without a CBDC, there is still the ability to social score people based on their actions, their non-actions. I'll give you an example. I know somebody who's a professor at a local university, and when a certain election might happen and a certain person might win an election who's not favored by the professoriate, they're weeping, and if you're not weeping, you're still standing out, even if you don't openly get overjoyed. If you don't wear a MAGA hat, for instance, but you're just not weeping, you're still standing out, and that's it happens in groups. And so absent CBDC, people are still aware of in-groups and out-groups. I mean, in Ethiopia, they had the Maoist kind of cell system under Mengistu, where every 10 people, either 10 or 100 people had to report to one, and that one, 100 of them had to report to one other. So there was kind of a pyramid scheme, like reverse Amway. Instead of making money, they had to collect souls, and this happened in East Europe, East Germany, and whatnot. So if you were an apartment house with 100 people in it, there's one person who's in charge, and he had to come up with a certain number of thought criminals every quarter, every week, or whatever it happens to be. And if he's not coming up with thought criminals, let's say everyone it was a good communist in that building. Well, if he's not coming up with them, that means he's not doing his job. He's not looking hard enough. So he has to basically sacrifice a certain number of people to the system. It has to be fed. It's kind of like your home furnace. Even when you're away, that it's keeping a certain temperature going. And so we always have this ordered system. Absent CBDC, we're having this system where people are being monitored by other people. So you basically go into that system or not. So the places where you can say things and do things are, I think not necessarily the default position of mankind. And we have to, as far as revolutions go, we have to figure out a way to get kind of the American Revolution, which is putting, powers against each other. There's no doubt that, I don't think Americans are better people per se or at birth than other people, but, we have a system where, they have competing, sociopaths. You have the various sociopaths kind of like against each other, and the government is there to kind of like, act as I guess a WEF, kind of, or WWF, excuse me, boxing, round where they can punch each other out till they're tired and they exert themselves. So I guess, in the sphere of the fact that humans are always going to want control, people are going to want control. What are our defenses, and what are the defenses you uncovered and found out on your own during the COVID era?
Right. Well, yeah. You see, the problem is the Rockefellers are up to their neck in the State Department, CIA, and their big Harvard review in the 70s. And this is part of the problem. Then I'll answer the question. Their big Harvard review with Kissinger, another sociopath, that brought in all the top leaders in the world and thought leaders and began to put this special project into place, which eventually broke on our shores as COVID and all the other madness. The CIA funded that as well. Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, and the CIA, it later transpired, also funded. So the problem is the State Department, CIA, it's not like Rockefellers and all the rich guys and powerful people are going solo. It was with the connections to CIA and State Department, because if there's going to be a new world order, in their own words in 1956, we need to create a new world order. Well, of course, State Department, CIA are all involved in that because America's going to have to be near the top of that new world order. So it's a big problem. And as a result, because there's so many players, not even getting into the massive banking families behind the scenes who are also linked in, though there may be some discord there with them and the new technocratic kind of rulers. It's awareness. And I always said there's a two-hander. You need to create awareness in the people, because if the people are aware of things like this, they will end it. At some percentage of people being aware, it'll get impossible to keep going. I mean, Rockefeller himself, I think, said in the 90s with CEOs of media organizations, big ones, he thanked them at a dinner for keeping the spotlight off the work that they were doing. Because in the light of public, scrutiny, there's no way we could push forward these programs. Interesting. So I think if awareness grows, and that's why we're seeing all the hate speech laws they want, that's chilling effect strategy. So it's to stop people talking, to stop people discussing. All the censorship in COVID. I personally got around some of it by being very careful what I said and to give references for everything, scientific references. And also you can use other words like cerveza sickness instead of saying the C word now. You get demonetized on YouTube for saying C19. Unbelievably, it's true. So you say cerveza sickness and people get to know. But awareness is the big thing. And the other thing is living the truth. Like Solzhenitsyn said, the only thing, a man needs to do his bit is to stop living the lie. So awareness and living the way you should. Use cash as much as possible. Use local suppliers of real food. Thwart the efforts to feed us processed junk food and make us dependent. Use real fuels and don't get trapped in the whole kind of green madness. Some of it's good, but don't get trapped dependent on services. Have your own fuel, have your own bit of land, have your own space, learn skills. So there's living it the way you should that opposes the system, but mostly there's awareness. We need awareness to get out there. And we saw recently in Japan, they had a big demonstration, which is not like Japanese. Thousands of people rejecting the WHO pandemic treaty and the World Health Regulations. Imagine ordinary people in Japan actually demonstrating in the streets. We had a referendum in Ireland, awareness of what's going on and other things. We threw back a 2-1 defeat, the biggest defeat in history of a referendum. By the way, the referendum wants to take kind of mothers and family out of the Constitution, put in some trans nonsense. That's a summary. They didn't say that exactly, but that's what it was about. And the people in Ireland have pushed back to the point that, desperate though they were to get in an insane hate speech law. I mean, I won't go through the details. Literally, it was written by the big brother. It's beyond belief. But public outcry has stopped that. They keep trying to bring it in and they keep backing off. Awareness is the most powerful weapon. I can't think of any other way than grassroots awareness to help save our society and our future. I honestly can't think of more important.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that on that. I have had on, I don't know if you know him, Daniel Jupp. I mentioned him earlier. He wrote The Gates of Hell. He's PhD, but he's working class by upbringing and by heritage. First person in his family to I guess go to university at all, and there's this incredible sensibility in the UK. I think it's playing out. It'll be playing out further of kind of replacement theory. Nobody wants to say that that's a real thing, but kind of replacing your own population with some mystical better population. I'm not sure it's a better population, but it's bringing in people who don't understand your mores, your culture, your society, and who will theoretically be beholden to you for having brought them in from a poorer place to this wealthier place, and in a sense kind of like trotting on the people. I think a lot of this comes down to kind of the duplicity behind this concept of helping people, helping humanity, and who that is. There's kind of a trope that says that the left loves humanity but actually hates people.
Yeah.
This kind of like trampling upon it. I'll just, one of my favorite quotes from H.L. Mencken. He's kind of the Mark Twain redux, early 20th century U.S. From Baltimore, a newspaper guy. And he said, democracy is the principle by which the people vote for what they want, and they deserve to get it, good and hard.
Yes, I mean, that's so true. By the way, just a quick thing. I investigated this mass migration because I saw, without even getting into detail, it was clearly another strategy of the ultra globalists, just along with Cerveza sickness and the desire for CBDC, or Tony Blair in the UK 15 years ago fighting for universal digital ID, and he didn't get it. People pushed back. It's self-evident what the strategies are. You just see them rammed down your throat by the main media, and they make no sense. Under that simple, heuristic, it's a globalist strategy. But the migration one, I thought, well, they just want to disrupt society, I guess. So I just investigated. It took me 10 minutes. It goes back 100 years. It's an old strategy. It goes back to Count Kalergi of the Pan-European Union. And he documented it all. I think Practical Idealism was his book in the 20s. I got a physical copy because it's so important. And he basically articulated it. He said we need to kind of essentially swamp Europe and all these very individualistic cultural nations, nationalistic, they have sovereignty. We want a global blob, right? The Pan-European Union back then, a UN New World Government now, same thing. So flood the zone with people, ideally from Africa and very different in culture and beliefs, so they won't integrate too much. And that will undermine society, undermine culture, history, memory, and society. And you know what, Randall? They are absolutely correct. And I do the same. It's the perfect strategy, because if you have got these red-haired Irish, with fiddles and whiskey, and they've got all this cultural memory, and you've got austere Swedes, and then you've got, the Danish have their own thing, and Germans. If you've got all this true diversity in the countries around the Western world, they are going to resist becoming a global blob. They will. They want to keep their own history and culture, obviously, and they've got nationality. What happens over time if you flood their zones with very different people who ghettoize, who don't tend to partake? You feed them masses of socialism, you give them loads of benefits, and you might get some voting from them as well because you brought them in, but that's a side dish. That's a side dish. The destruction of the sovereignty and national spirit is the primary goal of that strategy. And you know what? It works. I mean, I do it myself. It's smart.
Yeah, it works.
So, Kalergi 100 years ago, WEF, UN, European Council, Biden administration, yada, yada, today. It's the same strategy, and it's a good one. We got to remember that. It's a powerful and very clever strategy.
Yeah, no, I think it's there's nothing really new under the sun. Cortez took over Mexico with, I think, was it 54 soldiers? However many got on one of those wooden boats back in the day. Now Mexico was the city and the empire. There's the Aztec Empire, and Mexico was a huge city of its time. I think 250,000 people, and Cortez took over the place. Now, how did he do that? I mean, people in Mexico were not that happy with the Aztecs. They
sacrifices.
It's human sacrifice, and not only that, but on a massive scale. I mean, you have your little Juanita, you bring up from age 2, and he's a baby and all that kind of stuff. You see her first steps and whatever, and then she's going to be one of these literally sacrificial virgins, and hundreds of them, so forth, so you can get better weather. Climate gods. They actually had climate gods back then, and so we do different sacrifices now. Now we're sacrificing our kids. Secondarily, I guess we're doing similar sacrifices of our children to appease, some kind of like sensibility. And of course, we're sacrificing our non-children, the children we don't ever get, our grandchildren, whatever, because of climate gods. To any rate, but as far as the Cortez thing, the point is, it's the same thing. The British Raj, they took over India with very few Brits. It's easy to work on internal divisions and strife, and then insinuate yourself as the leader. Cortez did that in Mexico. The British have done that, elsewhere. The Arabs, took over huge swaths of population under the sword. This is kind of the general human endeavor to take over stuff. The George Gilder I had on the show, he divides humanity in two segments. One is the kind of the rape and pillage phase, which is the only way of accumulating wealth is basically, if it's being brought by the land and whatnot, is to get more land. And you have and labor, get more people. So you enslave people and take over their land. The modern day, the free market economy is such that you can make stuff without enslaving people. And then you have your idea. So if knowledge is continuous and if knowledge is shared, you can disintermediate the land people part of the equation in order to make wealth. You can have a widget, you can have an app, and you can get people to do things better, faster, smarter, and you can make money on kind of the commission aspect, the freemium model. So but the thing is, people still have not quite absorbed that. I think in the world of Islam, it's still much more on, they have some of our inventions. They got smartphones and cars and whatnot, which were not invented there. But the basic economy, the basic sensibility is to take more stuff. Anyway, how does all this play out?
Well, that does tie, though. You mentioned there about these strategies of taking over countries. So Rockefeller, yet again, always comes back, because not only are they hugely important, but they also have done extremely clever things. And one of them, you want to take over the world. How are you going to convince all these different nationalities with their own ethos and history to join up to your global blob, which, by the way, will have no diversity? So the people who talk about diversity and inclusion, they're the people fighting 24 hours a day to destroy all the diversity of all the different nations, cultures, history into one global blob. So just keep that in mind. But the other thing is, Rockefeller identified this mechanism of how you take over the world with a relatively small number of hugely powerful people. And basically, they identified that global hobgoblins, not their word, global crises would have to be brainstormed and leveraged over decades and indeed across generations. They knew they wouldn't be alive for their vision. This was multi-generational. And they identified 4 or 5 primary global hobgoblins back in the 50s that could be used as opportunities. You know what they were? Global health, right? You could convince people in a global health disaster that the global police and global government is required to fix the global disaster. So health, which became pandemics, of course. Climate disaster, that's global. And we can come in and save the people from a climate disaster. So they identified that. That's 2. End of oil and peak oil type stuff they identified. Now, they've dropped that one because it's too hard to hide that there isn't a peak oil problem. Remember, 30 years ago, they tried it. Didn't work out. Global macro terrorism, that didn't work out either. They got the Patriot Act through. They got a lot of bad laws through based on it. But people aren't buying global terrorism as a threat to everyone, right? So they dropped that. And the last one was financial disaster, financial crashes, macro crashes. And they always leverage those, but they haven't engineered a really big one yet. So there's the 5, identified half a century ago. And by God, did they play out in our lifetime?
Yeah. No, the funny thing is, as you were saying before, a lot of people feel as if they're doing the right thing. I mean, the Rockefellers were instrumental in creating the WHO. And the UN, their own private club, Dr. Nordengerd said, originally. Yeah. Now it's got bigger, but they gave the buildings in New York, 1946, they funded it, and they saw the UN as a future world government. And that's as early as the 50s. That was the plan. And we're heading there, right? A little bit of irony here because, the Rockefellers got their money through, Standard Oil. I think John D., the original, found oil in Western Pennsylvania. It's not no longer, it's not really the Saudi Arabia, even of the United States. We found bigger oil patches elsewhere. And the thing I mentioned in my Gates of Hell review interview is that the guys who made the money, if you didn't make your money through raping and pillaging, you made your money through voluntary donations of people's money to you. So oil, the discovery of oil, however people feel about oil now, they throw soup at paintings now over it. But there's almost nothing we would have today absent oil. And ranging from I think even my shirt is partially synthetic, and it's oil based. There's some nylon-ish products in it. The plastic around your casing of your computer,
fertilizer, all our foods.
Yeah, and just kind of running everything. It's the most amazing portable fuel and so forth. And Bill Gates, Windows, even if he didn't invent the actual concept and engineering thereof, I think Windows and then smartphones and Amazon, all these things are providing the George Gilder type of secondary wealth you can get without raping and pillaging. So these are huge peaceful revolutions. I think the oil revolution, the computer revolution, the kind of what I call the worldwide robot of like Amazon, getting things. I don't have something, I could have a robot get me something, but I actually have a intermediated robot by just thinking of it, looking on a phone, I find the thing and product's there tomorrow. It's an amazing thing, and you can get yourself to the airport with a robot. It's called Uber or whatever. We have this robot sensibility, and so I don't have to go plunder for anything lately. And
well, it's interesting though. I just picked up there when you mentioned old Billy Boy, and I'm not sure even his name now might get you demonetized. It's got that crazy. But because we have Rockefeller as the theme, and I know we're going to get, before we finish, to some of the other interesting stuff as to the involvement of the Rockefellers with other nasty business. But I'd have to say, Bill Gates, I found out from Professor Richard Werner. Really quick background. Back as an engineer in IT world, largely high volume manufacturing, I was always surprised by Bill Gates because I assessed him as not a very competent person. And he didn't fit with me of really inventing all this. Something was wrong, but I figured he got lucky because he got the sweetheart deal with IBM, which I found surprising at the time. Why did IBM give him an incredible sweetheart deal? I mean, was he sleeping with the IBM CEO? Or I couldn't understand it, Randall. Honestly, this is truthful. This is decades ago. And then Professor Richard Werner clued me in last summer in Amsterdam. And we talked briefly about Gates. And he says, well, Bill's father, Bill Gates Sr., was senior counsel for Rockefeller Foundation. And I said, no, I didn't know that. He says, yeah. And he says, the whole Microsoft thing? Well, he said a lot of people in the know surmised that they spot young Bill Jr. They know the internet age is coming, computers. They want to have their massive paws all over it. And they say, hey, Bill Sr., your son, look, he could be a computer nerd, right? And then it gets better. Bill Gates' father was in Planned Parenthood, the eugenics outfit, with the CEO of IBM at the time. Every single aspect of what we talk about, you scratch it and you're straight down to Rockefeller. I mean, look at Maurice Strong, right? Maurice Strong's an oil billionaire in Canada. Question marks around him early on, and he became an absolute nutter for the rest of his life in the UN and the climate nonsense. Okay, then. He gets in with the Rockefellers back in the 60s, 70s, and suddenly he drops the billionaire oil thing. And where does he go? Professor Werner said he went to the UN. Oh, the UN. As a security manager, initially. I mean, a couple of phone calls, he's in there as security manager. Within a year or two, he's head of the Environmental Disaster Division of the UN, right? Straight back to Rockefeller again. And you could go on all day. All day. Every single thread of our modern challenge, almost, when you scratch and look at the individuals, you go into the rat's nest of Club of Rome, Trilateral Commission, Rockefeller Foundation, yada, yada. The ID, I just got to give you another one. 2019 Common Pass for vaccine passports, okay? Who funded that? Rockefeller Foundation and Bill Gates Microsoft.
Hmm.
I mean, everywhere in the infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I think it's there. I don't put Rockefeller up to everything. I think they as you're talking about, in the 50s and 60s, I think they templated this. And again, a lot of reasonable intentions, because I think it's always a mistake to think of things acontextually. And at the time, we were in the Cold War, and you didn't want the Soviets' world order. There was people poo-poo the domino theory, but there were countries falling to communism, and there was a power struggle of one type or another, and you wanted, presumably, if they were on the American side, and I think America is preferable to the Soviets, they wanted something that was where people were healthy enough. If you look at their intentions as reasonable, the World Health Organization, I mean, obviously has a nice ring to it. You want people, starving in Africa, or falling to diseases that they wouldn't have to. Things are good to a point. I think that I'm not an anti-vax person per se. I'm an anti-multiple, supernumerary, supercilious, inconsequential, overzealous vax schedule. But I'm not against vaccines per se. I think the rubella vaccine was reasonable, and a few others and so forth are reasonable. I think having a COVID vaccine after the fact, and after you've had the illness, those are absurdities and whatnot. So I think these systems get perverted over time. I don't think Bill Gates is entirely wrong about wanting to kind of quash malaria in Africa, one of the original tenets of his foundation. But I think that when you start bioengineering mosquitoes, I mean, you wind up with certain issues and whatnot. I think the real issue, the real problem is that, getting back to Linus Pauling syndrome, is that when people when they stop doing the thing at which they're good, which actually gave them the money, they don't think that, I got a lot of money because I was doing this thing that people gave their money to me voluntarily. Rather than kind of doubling down on that aspect. I'm old enough to remember when the third, it wasn't really called the third world then, but the impoverished world, they were literally starving. People were literally starving in India, literally starving all through Africa. We don't see quite the same level of famine. We see much better, conditions in the, I think it's a Rockefeller term, the third world, whatever. We see much better conditions because people have computers, because they have smartphones, because they can do commerce. And so the original intention and oil and whatnot, the original products of these guys, Bezos, Amazon, whatever, these things are useful products. And where things go wrong is when they start to think, because they did this good thing, their ideas are good for B, C, D, and E, and F, and they have to, and they don't let anything percolate from below.
So yeah, I'd agree in principle with that idea, that when they get together and they want to be God and they want to be these amazing philanthropists, or philanthropaths, I think is a better term for these guys. There's an element of that, but I think the big game, the huge game, the Pareto principle 90-10 game is, all of these things about saving kids in Africa and everything are scams. They entrain vast armies of useful idiots and apparatchiks in UN divisions and WHO departments. And David Bell of the WHO, quite senior there and worked with Gates, said a lot of the WHO is full of good people who think they're doing good. But unfortunately, the fact is the whole thing is a totalitarian disaster. But the people within it believe the stuff. The reality is that the likes of Gates, case in point, just take him for a moment. So it looks like Daddy got him in. It looks like CEO of IBM looked after him, and it looks like the Kingmakers did their thing. Not proven, looks like that. How do you judge him? I'll tell you a couple of ways you judge whether it's misguided altruism. Bill in Microsoft, when his partner got cancer and had to drop out of the company for a short while, it's on the record, tried to steal his share of the company off him. Right, that's the type of guy he is. Another guy said when he's brought to the Supreme Court for megalomania, not philanthropy mania, his Microsoft antitrust thing, you look at the footage in Supreme Court, Did you ever see the footage of him being questioned?
No.
Shocking. I'll send it to you afterwards. Shocking. I didn't have to manage people for 25 years to look at that and see what I'm looking at. Shocking footage. Nodding there, monotone, absolute socio on the spectrum, whatever. So that's just a fact. But someone comically said, and I'll finish with this, so he's a megalomaniac. He goes after his partner and tries to take everything off him when he has cancer, right? It's disgusting. All on the record. And when his megalomania is checked and he loses in the Supreme Court, the next morning he wakes up and what? He suddenly wants to save black babies in Africa from malaria. And this person said, if anyone believes a shred of that, I've got a bridge to sell them.
Right.
We got to face reality.
No, I can understand that. Everyone's always, yeah. I mean, the Clinton Foundation had their Haiti initiative, and poor Haiti, and rich Clintons. You know, yes. A lot of these things are subservient, and it's pablum for the masses, and it's a sadness that, you know, we've seen such media complicity. You know, today, you know, our U.S. media has, you know, awakened to the ongoing dementia of Joe Biden. You know, but they're only doing it in service of a secondary purpose, which is to maintain their, you know, democratic, you know, operatives, you know, attention and whatnot. They're doing it in service. They're only honest by accident. A little bit like that broken clock being right twice a day. They're only being honest because that's the, you know, there's an old quote. I used to think it was the Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary. He's kind of a Mark Twain contemporary also. Or Mark Twain light, but there's a I can't find this definition anywhere. I read it when I was young, my 20s. It said a lawyer or attorney. It was definition: a parasite who does not yet realize he is such because no one has yet paid him to do so.
Yeah,
so in this case, this seems to be applicable to the press, that they are being honest, but only because that's the last resort.
Well, Randall, yeah, I mean, absolutely. The media is completely lost. And just a quick example, swine flu. So Der Spiegel magazine in 2010 basically did an article that explained in 10 full pages, mainstream, how the WHO faked the whole pandemic. And they even put in horrifying details about the WHO had met with around 25 senior pharma people in Geneva and agreed to change the pandemic definition to take out the severity clause. So any bloody virus with PCR, if it was in multiple countries and it was technically novel or new, that's a pandemic. We can get the V things in. So incredible article. JAMA BMJ also covered how the WHO faked a pandemic, right? The media did their job. So clear as crystal in the last 12, 13 years before the cerveza sickness, they bought the media. Complete media capture. All the CEOs and the VPs in the media are the ones who set the tone, right down to the smallest journalist. All the journals know what progresses their career and they know what ends their career. Remember in the Iraq War, a whole bunch of journalists got fired just for asking questions, right? That's how it works. So you have the CEOs, you have the VPs, they're over in Davos, wine and champagne, caviar, they're with ESG, DEI, they're all in with the Rockefeller stuff started 50, 60 years ago and now become a monster. And I agree with you, Randall. They started off with maybe some idea that it'll be better and it'll be good, but they created a monster that is now rampaging, and bad actors and profiteers and corporations and other organizations and NGOs are feeding off this massive monster like bloated ticks. So we got to get awareness out. We got to start popping these ticks.
Yeah. Now this is a funny thing. This is the actual real virus.
Yeah, yes. They are the virus. I mean, and they're bringing new strains. This NGO, that NGO, Club of Rome, this other organization, this new puppetician or bent politician.
I'm going to put in one. I always like to find some silver lining. That's probably a character.
Oh, yes. Awareness. If people get aware, Randall, this whole thing will become untenable. It'll all get fixed.
in the U.S., I don't know if you're familiar with the recent Supreme Court rulings, but there's a Chevron decision.
Yeah,
So the
big
irony,
deal.
I looked into this a little bit. The irony is that the Chevron decision actually was in favor of Ronald Reagan's administration. They were trying to beat back the National Resource Defense Council or something like that, which was trying to use, which was basically trying to use lawfare against an oil company. Getting back to Rockefeller and oil.
Mm.
So Chevron produces oil. We use gasoline and whatnot. And this I think it was National Resource Defense Council, whatever, they're suing Chevron, and they're saying basically, oh, I know they thought the Ronald Reagan's administrative state was not tiger enough, that Reagan had turned down the EPA, which was not his own agency, and he didn't really like it, and so he was cutting back the regulations from the EPA, and the NRDC and NGO said, we need more regulations. You're not regulating the oil companies enough, because it's kind of this regulatory capture. The NGOs are using the administrative state to do their stuff, and then they get more money from it. So more like leeches than a virus. Going to change medical metaphors. They were angry and they sued, and the court said no. The Reagan's EPA is allowed to be Reagan's EPA. We elected the guy, and it's a version. It's a subservient to Reagan, that he's allowed to make the bureaucracy unrapacious. And so that was the original Chevron case, ironically enough. And of course, like anything else, like the Patriot Act and whatnot, it gets distorted and inverted when other forces come into power in the U.S. We change regimes, whatnot. They said, oh, so now, so it basically got misused as the bureaucracy is always right. And this was a misinterpretation of it, and everything got adjudicated within the bureaucracy. So they overturned that recently because fishermen had to pay to have their own regulators on their boats at like $700 a day, and they couldn't stand it, and they wound up suing. They overturned this thing. So the NGOs will not have the same power, because really all was happening with these bureaucracies. Once they had the incredible power to do anything, and their rules all stood, is that the NGOs were telling the bureaucracies what to do, and they were feeding the NGOs. So hopefully we're going to have a little bit of turning back from 11, some lower number on the scale. And insofar as you can have the popular revolt, and we see the bubblings of Brexit, and then Frexit, and with other things. It seems like it's almost Sisyphean. We get up the hill and then get pushed back. So it comes down to a kind of a populist struggle in a sense. And I'm not for populism per se, but I think that people have a sense of what they want, and they should be allowed to live in their own communities and figure things out in a way without these supervening authorities. And this is, I think, the essence of Brexit and the essence of some of these other decisions. Anyway,
just to finish on that one, absolutely, that's a really important ruling. But to give it a context from Ireland, even though the problem is universal, of course, Ireland now, around 90% of the funding of NGO, non-governmental organizations, and they are bestial, rapacious. The NGOs in Ireland are just, they literally make my skin crawl, generally. 90% of the funding comes from our taxes. The government, 90% of the funding throws our money at the NGOs. The NGOs use it to lobby the government back to bring in Marxism, trans madness, whatever, climate nuttery. It's insane. It's like a massive, it's like ticks on top of ticks, but we're feeding them the blood. So if awareness grows, and we have seen now in the last couple of years, awareness is growing, not that they understand what you and I are talking about. When the referendum was thrown back in the government and the NGOs' faces, most of the people who voted no don't understand what you and I are talking about, but they smell something. They know something's rotten in politics, NGOs. Why are they doing what they're doing? There's something rotten. They're sensing, Randall. And if we get more awareness, you'll put rigor and structure on their sense that something's gone wrong. And we just need the people to begin to look upwards. People are looking around at their neighbor or the immigration problem. They're looking at the people coming in. People coming in are blame-free. They're just looking for a better life. You need to look at why, the root cause of why migration in Ireland is absolutely off the scale. We have
crazy.
10 cities.
It's a small country.
It's
There's 10 million people there, and they're taking in like 1 or 2 million more. It's a silliness.
It's just nuts. But if you see something that's nuts, you know something's wrong. 78% of people in Ireland recently, in a Red C top poll, said the government needs to stop this. And the government keep doing it. So they ignore 76% of their voters. But people are beginning to realize
this. They're basically doing...
Look up. Why are our politicians doing things against over 3/4 of the population's wishes, and they make no sense? And the nonsense about saving Ukraine is ridiculous, because they sent out the request to flood Ireland on Twitter, our minister, in 8 or 9 different languages on the same day. Ukrainian was one language, but Georgian and African, multiple was other. So we know they're lying. So this is the thing. If people begin to not only realize that the politicians have become rotten, the media has become rotten as a 3-week-old corpse in the sun, not only that, but if people begin to look up to see where it all comes from, it doesn't come from the media. It doesn't come from our politicians. Of course it doesn't. It comes from what we're talking about. And I got to run. Sorry, Randall, but you had a couple of other Rockefeller examples. I'd love you to just give one or two of those.
Have to come back on. I want to show people your webpage, first of all, and they can help us support you and find you. They can also find you on X, Ivor Cummins, and you have some great interviews and so forth. I'm trying to follow this one with Viva Fry you have up.
Nice
and
guy.
Before people go, as far as the Rockefellers go, this is my article in Brownstone, and it's really
Brownstone. Yes,
the opioid crisis. People don't realize. People think it's fentanyl or OxyContin, but oddly enough, this all started with methadone maintenance, and which started at Rockefeller University, as we have here. Anyway, and if people want to support my podcast, speaking about scandemics and whatnot, I have a book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. People buy this book, they'll send money to me partially, a little bit to Jeff Bezos, and if they read it, even better. That's
Randall, we did a superb conversation on that book and that topic, and it was an absolute eye-opener to me, and that's on my YouTube as well if people want to dig. But there's one last thing I'll finish with. Just one other Rockefeller. Before the interview started, I mentioned this, and you said, well, hold it for the interview. So someone gave a presentation in Zurich last week on the Great Taking, David Rogers Webb, and all this crazy stuff over 60 years, that legal structures all over America and every state in Europe now, you don't really own your own securities, like bank balances, shares. Technically, legally, you don't. They'll all go to JP Morgan. But that's the person giving the talk on the Great Taking focused on, back in the 60s or maybe 70s, this CIA operative, longtime CIA operative with no background in banking or finance, was made head of a new big division and spent 22 years bringing in these laws to take the ownership of securities away from the people, right? That person, Densger, I think, or something, I was able to put up my hand at the end and say, who put him in there? And the people didn't know. Nelson Rockefeller appointed him as the head of all this financial new organization in New York. So even this guy, the whole Great Taking story, that's separate to the Rockefeller story completely. I spotted Nelson put the main guy in, and he was CIA, and then he got through all the laws state by state, because they could not go to federal, because then there'd be scrutiny, right? Light of scrutiny. So they went state by state over a decade or two to slowly change the Universal Commercial Code. And the CIA guy did it, and Nelson Rockefeller put him in there.
All right. Well, lovely, Ivor. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being on, and I'll have this up soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall.